One of the things we were very excited about when we forged our partnership with the Nation Network was the ability to work more closely, more hand in hand with some of their fantastic content producers. And one of them joins us now from the Athletic and Canucks Conversation, our old friend Harman Dayal. How are you?
Hey, Harm.
Doing great, guys. How are you?
Yeah, fantastic. Great to see you. Great to hear your voice, all those things. I've been following your work. And let's start with the sustainability of this Vancouver Canucks team. This is a recent article that you've written on The Athletic. Of course, fantastic shape right now through the first 15 games of the season. The underlying metrics weren't exactly pointing towards this degree of success. 11-3-1 through 15, Harm. How sustainable is this for the Vancouver Canucks?
Well, obviously, they're going to cool off at some point, but they've built up such a cushion for themselves with this start that I would be surprised, especially when you look at some of the actual substance behind the start, factors such as the power play, the improved defensive play at 5-on-5, how talented their goaltending tandem is, the star power they have at the top of their lineup. I would be surprised if the bottom sort of falls out and we have some sort of collapse here. I'm expecting this to be a playoff team. Again, the thing to keep in mind is I'd be more concerned about PDO and some of these metrics that point to, okay, the Canucks have been lucky, if they were squeaking out a bunch of 3-2 wins and they were winning by the scruff of their neck, but they've been blowing teams out. And the other thing to keep in mind is when you look at their PDO and you take away some of the blowout wins they've had, the 10-1 Sharks, a couple against the Oilers, 5-0 against St. Louis. If you remove those games entirely, they still have a really good record, and their PDO all of a sudden is inflated, but it's not 107 or 108, something that would be totally alarming. So when I look at this team, I really do think that even though they're going to cool down, I still see a lot of positive signs, and I expect, again, them to make the playoffs, especially when you look at how many other teams in the West have had a tough start. Obviously, Edmonton, Calgary, Seattle, even in the Central, team that may have been competing for a wild card spot, a club like the Minnesota Wild have been off to a really tough start. So especially in the NHL, where even with losses, as long as you force them to overtime or shootout, you can still pick up points. It's tough for teams behind you to make up ground. And we saw that during the Canucks' Boudreau era, where Boudreau took over, and it just felt like the Canucks were perpetually, no matter how much they won, sort of stuck in that 3 to 6 points, 3 to 7 points outside the playoff bar, and they just couldn't gain ground. And the Canucks are on the reverse side of that now, where they've got the cushion, and they've got a lot of teams that, even though there's a bunch of hockey still to be played, a lot of distance to make up.
Yeah, I almost forget what overtime is like with the Vancouver. They've only gone there once, 11 regulation wins out of the 11 they have.
And defensively too, Harm, those big blowout games sort of show their stats improperly too, because the score effects there's, they get into prevent defense when you're up 3 goals, and like the Sharks outshot them. In a 10-1 loss. So the stats are going to really be hard to nail down here, given the score lines that the Canucks have put up this season.
Absolutely. And the other thing to keep in mind is I've seen a lot of people reference the Canucks' subpar ability to control 5-on-5 expected goals. And that's fair enough. But you look at the other side of the coin, their ability to control 5-on-5 shot volume. I was looking at it the other day. They're 10th in the NHL, guys. That's legitimately good. And usually there isn't such a wide disparity between controlling shot volume and expected goals, but that's sort of what happens sometimes when you have such a small sample. And while I've seen a lot of sort of national analysts outside of Vancouver pointing to, oh, the expected goals are a red flag, I don't see nearly enough sort of credit for, well, the other side of the coin in terms of how they're at least controlling shots, possession, territorial control. There are some legitimately positive indicators there. And the other thing to keep in mind is when I did this piece looking under the hood of the Canucks' start about a week ago, I looked at teams that got off to a hot start, had a really high PDO through the first 11 to 12 games, and had a tough time controlling expected goals. And the overwhelming majority of them still ended up making the playoffs. So again, it just sort of goes to show that, yes, there are a couple metrics that may point to they've had some bounces go their way, but I still believe that this is good hockey.
Yeah, no, we talked about it last week. These sorts of starts, very few teams have screwed it up from here. how concerned should they be with the Carson Soucy injury and how that relates to sustaining this start?
Yeah, Soucy's been dependable for them, and I'm curious to see how Nikita sort of looks, because looked positive down the stretch last season for the few games that he got into, and then in training camp and preseason, honestly, he impressed me. I thought he cleanly outplayed Christian Wolanin, and this is a player that we don't have a ton to read on in terms of a history, a pro resume. So it could go either way here. I think where the Canucks will miss Soucy the most is the penalty kill, where his size and reach has played an instrumental role. I think his size and shutdown ability, holding leads in the third period, is going to be an area where, even though I like Hiros's puck moving, I like his hockey IQ, it's just not the same. He is slight. He is a little undersized. So that's an area to sort of keep an eye on. Look, it stings, but the other thing to keep in mind is Soucy hasn't been playing top 4 minutes. It's not as if he's been playing the toughest matchups on this blue line. And what I look at now is I'd like to continue to see Filip Hronek, for example, get back to the level that he has been for most of the season. I think over the last couple of games in Toronto and Montreal, I thought he's looked a little shakier than usual. Some defensive miscues, not moving the puck as cleanly. In the Toronto game, for example, the Hughes-Hronek pair got dinged for a couple 5-on-5 goals against. I think it's going to come down to, again, can Hughes and Hronek maintain what they've shown us for most of the season, which has been dominant form. And I think as long as that holds up, that the Canucks can weather the storm of a Soucy injury, so long as it's not too long.
No counting stats for Hirose at the AHL level, and not that he's a high octane offensive defenseman, but you just think for a puck mover you'd accidentally get second assists in some way, shape, or form. And it's only an 11 games, smaller sample there, but are you surprised that didn't happen for him down there?
A little bit surprised, especially because you looked at him at the Penticton Young Stars tournament, for example, and I know it was a bit of a stretch to call him a prospect at that point, considering he's already 23 or 24. But he was racking up points with ease, and obviously that hasn't quite translated yet. But coming into the NHL, that's not his job, right? He's not going to be expected to play a second unit power play. The Canucks don't need offense from him. They just need steady puck moving. They need him to use his quickness and IQ to anticipate plays in the defensive zone early, so that he's able to make stops and ensure that his pair isn't caught down low in the defensive zone on those heavy cycle shifts, where that's when maybe his size and inexperience could be a bit more of a challenge. So yeah, a little bit surprised that he hasn't had huge counting stats so far, but it's, as it pertains to how his play will translate at the NHL level, it doesn't concern me one bit.
In terms of fortifying the blue line on a broader scale, of course, the Calgary Flames have the potential for a Black Friday sale coming up here. Everybody knows Chris Tanev. Everybody loves Chris Tanev. Everybody kind of wants Chris Tanev. But might there be a different kind of player available in Nikita Zadorov that is equally as intriguing? How do you rank the two possibilities for the Canucks, and where to spend assets? If they're going to spend assets, and they'll have to spend assets for either of those two defensemen, what makes the most sense for the Canucks?
Yeah, so Zadorov's a good player, but the concern I have is he's a left shot. And you look at the Canucks' blue line right now, once Soucy returns, you're already kind of set there with Hughes, Cole, and Soucy, which means that for this fit to make any sense, the coaching staff would have to, first of all, be comfortable playing a left shot defenseman on the right side, which they've been really reluctant to do so far. I mean, think about it, guys. Going through training camp and preseason, the Canucks were giving extended looks to Noah Juleson and Cole McWard on that top pair next to Quinn Hughes, before eventually slotting Hronek there and acquiring Mark Friedman. And that was just to sort of maintain the lefty-righty balance. So right off the bat, that sort of concerns me, just in terms of a logistical fit. And then secondly, I think there's a broader conversation about, are the Canucks at a point this early where they should be spending assets for a rental defenseman? They're already without their second-round pick this year. They're already without their third-round pick the year after. I think what a lot of people would like to perhaps see is, okay, if you're going to go out and spend assets for a player, you want it to ideally be a long-term fit, somebody who can help for multiple seasons and people have brought up that, hey, Cole's only signed for this season. He's on an expiring contract. So could Zadorov slot in as a second pair piece beyond this season? And there's some legit merit to that idea. But the concern I'd have, or at least the question mark I'd have, is that Zadorov already makes $3.75 million, which means his next contract is going to be pretty lucrative, especially considering how sort of unique his size and physicality combination is. And yet you look at his last couple seasons, he's predominantly been used in a third pair role. Now, Calgary's blue line is really deep, and that's partly why. But this is a player that hasn't proven himself yet to be a top four driver. He played tougher sort of high leverage minutes for 1 year in Chicago, the 2021 season, and there were mixed results. And Chicago dealt him at the end of that season. Spent another couple of seasons in between 2016 and 2018 during Colorado's leanest rebuild years in that type of role. And again, mixed results. And that's not to say that Zadorov can't be an effective top four defenseman, but he hasn't proven himself and given that definitive evidence yet. And when you consider that the Canucks already have Carson Soucy, who's in a similar boat as a number 4 or 5 defenseman, who hasn't proven himself in tough top four matchups. Especially considering how tight the Canucks are up against the cap. When I think about potentially handing out another lucrative contract on the blue line, I'd prefer it to be for a top four righty. And if it must be a lefty, I'd prefer it to be for a player who has a higher top four ceiling than Zadorov.
Yeah, I mean, he'll be 29 in free agency. Like, you think he gets a 4 or 5 year deal, something like that, Harm?
Potentially, especially sort of depends on how much the cap goes up, how many teams have that cap flexibility, how the defense market obviously shakes out. But considering his unique physical traits, I think this is a player that will be pretty highly sought after. And again, this is already a guy that is making 3.75. So it's not as if the cap hit is going to be cheap either. So it just seems like a contract that is going to be pretty hefty. And for a Canucks team that already has options on the left side of their blue line, just not sure that it's the best fit, even though, again, I really like the player.
Yeah, he made a lot of noise in Tuesday night's game, too.
Yeah, he
knows he's got
he's being watched right now. What about Tanev, Harm?
So Tanev would obviously be, I think, a much better logistical fit. The acquisition cost is just the biggest question mark, guys. I think, again, is it a rental? Is there a fit beyond the season? He's going to be turning 34 pretty soon. He isn't quite the same player that he was during his first couple of seasons in Calgary, still effectively able to hold down a top four role. But again, to me, look, if we get to July 1st and we're at a point where Tanev's available and the term, he isn't looking for a 3-4 year deal, then at that point, I think the fit makes a ton of sense, especially given his familiarity, his skill set, his handedness. But to pay the price to get ahead of it when you don't have certainty about whether you'd be able to re-sign him right away, I think I'd need to see more from this team. I think this team would need to prove that, okay, they're not just a playoff team, but this is a team that is ready to actually make some noise if and when they do get in. They have to prove themselves as a contender, and that's another sort of step up for me in terms of what this team would have to sort of show over the next 20, 25 games, because, again, I think you would have to view this team as a contender to justify giving up valuable future assets for a rental here.
Lastly, we'll ask you our poll question here. Most likely to be in the Canucks Ring of Honor. And I don't know if you're a big ring or a small ring guy, Harm, but Miller, Horvat, neither or both, where would you cast your vote?
Yeah, I'm a small ring type of guy personally. I tend to be a little bit more selective. I don't think Bo's done enough personally. I think he was a solid second line center for many years here. But especially given the lack of team success, which isn't really on him, but just feels like there weren't enough big moments. He wasn't enough of a sort of high-end elite player, and nor was he here for long enough, right? This isn't a player that spent his entire career here. So no for him. For JT, that's still to be determined. I don't think he's quite done enough yet, but this is a player that's been, I mean, since he's joined, among the NHL's point leaders, and considering the term left on his deal, he's going to be here for a really long time. So given how many years are still to go, he's going to really climb up the franchise leaderboard in a lot of statistical categories. And especially if this team can start to get some success and get headed in the right trajectory, I think Miller, for him, the Ring of Honor is definitely feasible. It's definitely realistic for him to get there if he can sort of maintain the type of level that he's shown over the last few years in Vancouver for, a handful more.
And of course, especially if they do get that elusive team success going forward.
Yeah.
Harman, fantastic stuff, my friend. Good to hear your voice again. We'll catch up soon.
Thank you, guys.
Finning Canada is your local dealer for cat equipment built to handle work in Western Canada. Visit finning.com for a location nearest you.